Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Monday, April 14th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Starting this week, we're trying something a little different with Central Valley Daily. On Mondays, instead of the day's top headlines, we're going to bring you one deep dive into a topic we think warrants some extra attention. This week, should the IRS be handing over undocumented people's tax information to the federal government?
There's an agreement now between the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security and ICE in particular that allows data sharing that hasn't happened before.
Our conversation with a national tax policy reporter in just a moment. And a reminder, you can always find the day's local and national headlines on your radio. They air at the top and bottom of the hour. Just tune to 89.3 FM in Fresno, 89.1 in Bakersfield, or tell your smart speaker to play KVPR.
The annual KVPR wine tasting is coming Sunday, May 4th. Once again, we'll be gathering at the beautiful Lester Estate on the San Joaquin River for an afternoon of wine and beer sampling, delectable food, and great friends. There will be live music, a silent auction, and a raffle to win $1,500. Complimentary round-trip bus transportation, including lunch, will be provided in Bakersfield and Visalia. Tickets are now on sale at kvpr.org/wine.
And now to today's feature story. April 15th is tax day. Millions of people are getting their taxes in before tomorrow's deadline, and that includes many people without legal status in the U.S. The latest data from 2023 shows undocumented immigrants compose less than 5% of the U.S. workforce, but they pay upwards of $89 billion in taxes. That's billion with a B. But now the Trump administration wants to access the tax data of undocumented people. Last week, the Internal Revenue Service entered into an agreement with the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, to share that information. DHS oversees U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE. At this point, we don't have a lot of details, but the Trump administration's goal is to identify people who have violated criminal immigration laws, which could in turn lead to deportations. This move by the Trump administration is prompting larger questions over the safety and weaponization of people's tax information. And just last week, the IRS commissioner announced she would resign. To get perspective from Washington, D.C., we spoke with Richard Rubin. He's covered tax policy for the Wall Street Journal since 2015. He starts by explaining what he knows so far.
We only are getting very limited windows into what's happening. But what's happening is there's an agreement now between the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security and ICE in particular that allows data sharing that hasn't happened before that will give DHS and ICE more information in order to be able to conduct criminal investigations in the immigration area. So the IRS has this giant trove of data, as one might expect, right? Like the IRS is getting data from tax returns all the time, is getting data from employers. Like it's got this giant data trove. And there's a set of laws around when IRS employees can share that information. And you can see why ICE might want information about people's names, addresses, whatever other information to be able to try to find people who they are trying to arrest and deport or trying to investigate for crimes.
Do we know specifically what data is being shared under this new agreement?
So we don't. So the only version of the agreement, we've seen a version that was a draft from a month or so ago. Then there's a final version that was filed as part of a lawsuit against the government by some immigration rights groups. And a lot of the key provisions are redacted from that. So we don't know what actually, if anything, actually has been shared yet. The way this works, taxpayer privacy law is written as a thou shalt not, and then there are a bunch of exceptions. And one of the exceptions, the one that they're using here, is for information that could be used in criminal proceedings. And it basically says, look, if some other agency outside of the IRS, whether it's the FBI or whoever, without a court order, asks, for information, provides enough information about the identity of a taxpayer, and then asks for tax information, the IRS shall provide it. So that's kind of what they're using here. Is it seems like for the draft version that we saw and what we reported a month or so ago, that what at least in part the idea is that ICE would send the IRS a list and say, okay, here are people who we believe are committing a crime. In this case, the crime is most likely willful refusal of a removal order, right? It's not just like crossing, it's like removal order and then not leaving, which is a crime. And, here's the names and addresses that we have. Like, does that match what you have? Okay. And then the IRS would say yes or no. That's kind of one possible understanding of what this might be.
So not necessarily like a blanket sharing of these people's personal information. It would be ICE reaching out to the IRS over specific people.
Again, we're like squinting to understand what they're doing because they're not being clear about it. But that's, if you read the tax law here, it pretty clearly requires exactly that. It requires requests from an agency that are very particular about named people, and then the IRS can provide information.
You mentioned a lawsuit. My first thought when I read about this was, A, is this legal? And B, is this going to get bogged down in some sort of legal battle? So where do things stand now?
Yeah, we're still at the very early stages of this lawsuit. Is it legal? I think that's an open question because we don't really know what they're doing or what they're sharing. And the other tricky part about this, and this comes up a bit in the lawsuit filings, is it becomes illegal when information is provided from the IRS to ICE that it's not allowed to provide. So the mere agreement is sort of the framework for which that sharing might happen. But that agreement itself is just an agreement between two agencies. It's not like itself a crime or a problem or an illegality until actual information is shared. So you have these groups that are suing that are like, look, like we think our members and people we represent are likely to have their taxpayer privacy rights violated. And you have the government saying, well, we haven't done anything yet, right? Like there's no, right, as of the filing where they produced the agreement, they're like, okay, we have this agreement, but you can't like argue that we, the government, have violated something because we haven't actually done these transmissions yet. And you can't know whose information has been transmitted.
I think it's a misconception that undocumented people don't pay taxes. Could you speak to how much people without legal status in the U.S. actually contribute by taxes to the U.S. each year, and what it would look like if the country were to lose those funds?
Yeah, I don't have a great number offhand, but it's significant. And I think the important thing to remember is this is something that the IRS for decades has encouraged, right? It's basically said, even if you're here illegally, we will issue you an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number that looks like a social security number, but is not. And it's used to file taxes, right? It's used to report income, to pay taxes. And the idea is that the IRS has long told people, like, look, we don't share information. Like, we want you to be in compliance with the tax law. Many immigrants who've come here illegally, but then have tried to gain legal status, have wanted to comply with the tax law so that when they go through that process, they can say, look, immigration authorities, US of A, I have been paying taxes. I'm going to be a good citizen, a good permanent resident. So there's been kind of an understanding of the way this should work. This is sort of separate from like people who are using fake social security numbers. Like those people are paying taxes too, but these are where the IRS has the real information of people. These are people who are not authorized to work here necessarily, but are paying taxes as if they are.
Now, an interesting piece of all this, too, is that the acting IRS Commissioner, Melanie Krause, has announced that she would be stepping down. She is the third commissioner over the IRS just this year. I mean, it's only April, so that's pretty significant. Does the fact that Krause is leaving speak to other general issues happening in the IRS right now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, like her departure, there are several other senior officials in the past week who've announced their departure. The prior, there have been other departures from the IRS. Some are apparently over this sharing, right? The IRS is has certainly made mistakes in taxpayer privacy. Don't get me wrong, but like the culture of taxpayer privacy is important, and a core value of the IRS is very well ingrained in employees there. And so there have been internal concerns about violating that and changing that culture. And I think some of the departures reflect that. And then more broadly, the administration has been shrinking the IRS, has laid off thousands of people, is continuing to lay off IRS employees and change how it's doing its technology. And like there's more coming, I'm sure. So I think there's been a broader kind of shrinking of the tax agency that's going on that is concerning many like taxpayer advocates out there, and concerning, and itself is probably actually a larger potential revenue loss for the government than this data sharing, because what's been happening is audits of very high income people, audits of large companies are slowing or stopping as a result of all of the, many of the people who were hired over the past couple of years to start those have been, laid off.
So, Richard, where do we go from here? Has the data sharing started? Do we know? And should undocumented people who've been paying taxes be concerned at this point?
I mean, we don't know what data sharing has or is going to happen. And it's hard for me to try to advise someone on what to do here. It's a very tricky situation because you're trying to balance, I assume your, obligation and to comply with the tax law and try to be a good and prompt taxpayer with your, and do what the government has been telling you to do for years with your, with your interest in not being deported. Right. So I think it's a very tricky spot that people are in now. And it's, the important thing really is how much it's shifting, right? There was this, I think, equilibrium and status quo where people certainly were getting deported, right? And for years. So it's not that wasn't happening, but there was kind of an understanding that if you were here, you were paying taxes and the IRS wouldn't share information. And that's changing, and we're in a kind of different place right now. And I don't have a clear sense of what that's going to look like next week, let alone, 6 months or a year from now.
Richard Rubin, tax policy reporter for The Wall Street Journal. Thank you for breaking this down for us.
Oh, sure. Thanks for having me.
And according to the nonprofit Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, undocumented immigrants in California contributed $8.5 billion in state and local taxes in 2022. And that's today's show. Have feedback on our new Monday format or maybe a story idea? We would love to hear from you. Email podcast@kvpr.org. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
This is Tanya Mosley, co-host of Fresh Air. You'll see your favorite actors, directors, and comedians on late-night TV shows or YouTube. But what you get with Fresh Air is a deep dive. Spend some quality time with people like Billie Eilish, Questlove, Ariana Grande, Stephen Colbert, and so many more. We ask questions you won't hear asked anywhere else. Listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.